15-year-old Miriam was a cheerful, lively teenager who walked along a narrow, dusty road to her school in a small town. Her mornings were usually rushed, with her mother packing her bag and urging her to hurry. Despite her busy schedule, Miriam always took leftover food with her. For a long time, Miriam had noticed a strange man sitting by a broken fence near her school. This man was known in the neighborhood as the Madman. People were scared of him and often whispered about him. The villagers said he used to be a respected teacher, but something went wrong in his life, leaving him lost and confused. His real name was forgotten. Now they only called him the Madman. Unlike everyone else, Miriam wasn't scared of him. Instead, she felt sorry for him. Every morning, she quietly gave him a few naira notes or some leftover food, and every day, he would look at her with grateful eyes, though he couldn't speak much. Life wasn't easy for Miriam. Her father had died years ago, leaving her mother to take care of her and her younger siblings. They struggled to make a living, and Miriam often wore the same old school uniform. But helping the Madman felt good. She didn't have much, but she knew he had even less. One morning, as she reached the broken fence, Miriam noticed the Madman wasn't in his usual spot. She looked around, worried, and was about to continue walking when she saw him standing a little distance away, looking lost. She walked over to him and softly called out, "Uncle, it's me, Miriam. I brought you something," holding out some naira notes. The Madman looked at her, and for a brief moment, his eyes seemed clear. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but only nodded, took the money, and mumbled some words that didn't make sense. Miriam gave him a small smile and walked away, but something about their exchange felt strange. As days passed, the Madman began wading closer to her path. He would watch her as she approached and stare at her intensely as she gave him food or money. Miriam didn't think much of it at first. But one day when he took the money, his fingers brushed against her hand and stayed there a little too long. She quickly pulled her hand away and was hurrying to school when the Madman suddenly carried her from behind, covering her mouth, and dragged her to a nearby bush where he had intimacy with her. When he was done, Miriam cried, not only as a result of the pain, being her first time, but also the shame. She managed to walk out of there as she wouldn't stop bleeding, went into an uncompleted building where she cleaned herself up, sat there and cried till she heard the school closing bell being rung from afar, and she left for home without telling anyone, not even her mother, about what had happened. Soon, Miriam started feeling different. She was always tired, felt sick in the mornings, and had a strange feeling in her stomach. She thought it was just stress from school and helping at home, but deep down, a fear began to grow. Miriam's mother noticed her changes, especially how quiet she had become. Concerned, her mother tried asking her if she was okay, but Miriam only gave vague answers and avoided eye contact. Something was wrong, but Miriam couldn't explain it. Each day, Miriam dreaded her walk to school. She even tried taking different routes to avoid the broken fence, but somehow, the Madman always found her. His intense gaze made her feel trapped, and she started feeling both fear and guilt. She wanted to help him, but his presence now made her uncomfortable, as if he held a secret. One morning, Miriam's sickness became too much. She bent over in pain on her way to school. A teacher saw her and took her to the school nurse. After some questions, the nurse looked at Miriam with a serious expression and gently asked, "Miriam, are you all right? Is there something you want to tell me?" Miriam shook her head, avoiding the nurse's eyes. But the nurse wasn't convinced and soon called Miriam's mother. When her mother found out Miriam was pregnant, she was devastated. That night, her mother's cries filled their small house. Miriam sat on the floor, shaking, as her mind raced with questions. She couldn't explain what had happened. The memory of the Madman's lingering touch flashed in her mind, filling her with a chill. "Miriam, who did this to you?" her mother asked, her voice full of pain. But Miriam stayed silent. She didn't have an answer. The thought that it could be the Madman was horrifying, yet she couldn't shake it from her mind. The news spread through the village, and people whispered about Miriam. Her classmates looked at her with pity or disdain. The once cheerful Miriam was now weighed down by a reality she couldn't understand. Every day, she walked past the broken fence with a heavy heart. And every day, the Madman was there, watching her with those same intense eyes. He never spoke, only stared as she passed by. Her nights were filled with strange dreams of the broken fence and the Madman's face close to hers. She would wake up in fear, her heart pounding, leaving Miriam in a web of mystery and fear. After some time, Miriam stopped going to school. She could no longer face the stares and whispers from her classmates and teachers. Her body was changing, and the weight of the secret was too much for her young heart to carry. At home, her mother kept asking her, again and again, who was responsible for her pregnancy. "Miriam, please tell me. Who did this to you?" her mother would plead, her voice breaking each time. But Miriam stayed silent. She felt trapped, lost and scared. No words came, no answers she could give. Each time her mother asked, Miriam's head would drop, and she would look away, unable to face her mother's tearful eyes. Her silence only deepened her mother's pain. Her mother would sit in their small living room, crying day and night, wondering what had happened to her precious daughter. Sometimes she would cry loudly, her sobs filling the small house. Other times, she would sit quietly, tears streaming down her face as she held Miriam's hand, hoping her daughter would finally tell her the truth. The pain in her mother's heart was like a sharp knife. People in the village began to gossip even more. They would whisper to each other whenever they saw Miriam or her mother, saying hurtful things that reached Miriam's ears and made her feel even worse. At night, Miriam would lie in bed, unable to sleep. She would think of the madman, remembering his strange looks and the way he had touched her hand that one time. Fear gripped her heart, haunting her dreams. Her mother tried to stay strong, but each day, she looked weaker, as if the weight of Miriam's secret was draining the life out of her. She stopped going to the market as much, avoiding the villagers who would stare at her with pity or judgment. Miriam knew her mother was suffering, and guilt gnawed at her, but she didn't know how to make it right. One night, as they sat together in their tiny living room, her mother took Miriam's hands in hers and said softly, "Miriam, I am here for you. No matter what happened, you can tell me. I just want to understand." Miriam felt tears fill her eyes, but still, she couldn't bring herself to speak. She didn't have the answers her mother wanted, and the fear inside her was too great. She lowered her head, feeling the weight of her silence pressing down on her like a heavy stone. Days turned into weeks, and the house grew quiet, filled only with the sounds of her mother's quiet weeping at night. Miriam knew that her mother was praying, hoping for a miracle, for some kind of answer to bring peace to their broken home. One evening, Miriam's mother sat beside her daughter, holding her hand gently. She looked into Miriam's tired eyes, her own eyes filled with sadness and love. "Miriam, please, you can trust me. I am your mother. No matter what, I am here for you," she whispered, her voice soft yet full of pain. After a long silence, Miriam finally looked up, her face wet with tears. She took a deep, shaky breath and whispered, "Mama." It was the madman. The one by the school fence. Miriam's mother froze, her hand gripping Miriam's tighter. Shock filled her face as she struggled to understand what her daughter had just said. "The madman," she repeated, her voice trembling. "The one everyone calls crazy?" Miriam nodded slowly, her eyes full of fear and guilt. Her mother's heart shattered as she realized the horror her daughter must have gone through. How could this happen? How could her sweet, innocent child be hurt in such a way? Without another word, Miriam's mother stood up, her face set in anger and determination. She couldn't stay silent. She couldn't let this go. She had to confront the man who had done this to her daughter. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, her eyes blazing with fury, and headed straight for the broken fence where the madman always sat. As she marched down the dusty path, people turned to stare, sensing her anger. Some villagers followed her, curious about where she was going and why. They whispered to each other, wondering what had happened to make her so angry. But Miriam's mother didn't care about them. Her mind was focused on one thing only, the madman. When she reached the broken fence, she saw him sitting there, mumbling to himself and staring off into the distance. Her anger boiled over, and she stepped forward, pointing a finger at him. "What did you do to my daughter, you wicked man?" she shouted, her voice loud and filled with rage. "What did you do to my Miriam?" The madman slowly turned his head to look at her, a strange smile spreading across his face. Instead of answering her, he began to laugh, a low, chilling laugh that sent shivers down her spine. His laugh grew louder, echoing in the stillness around them. The villagers watching from a distance gasped, some covering their mouths in shock. "Why are you laughing?" Miriam's mother demanded, her face filled with anger and disgust. "Do you think this is funny? Do you understand what you've done?" But the madman only kept laughing, his eyes wild and empty, as if he didn't understand her words at all. He rocked back and forth, his laughter rising and falling like waves. The sound was eerie, almost haunting, as if he were lost in his own world, far from reality. Miriam's mother's face crumpled as she watched him. She didn't see regret or guilt in his eyes. Only madness, a strange emptiness that made her heart ache. She wanted to scream, to hit him, to make him understand the pain he had caused, but looking at him, she felt helpless. A few villagers stepped forward, whispering to Miriam's mother, trying to calm her down. "Please be careful," one woman said softly, putting a hand on her shoulder. "He's not well in the head. He doesn't understand." But Miriam's mother shook her head, her anger still burning. "How can he not understand? He hurt my child. My innocent daughter," she cried, her voice breaking with emotion. The madman's laughter slowly faded, and he looked at her with a strange expression, as if he were seeing her for the first time. He tilted his head, muttered something under his breath, and then began to laugh again, a softer, more chilling laugh. It was as if he didn't even remember what he had done or didn't care about the pain he had caused. Tears filled Miriam's mother's eyes as she took a step back, feeling defeated. She wanted answers, she wanted justice, but all she found was a man lost in madness, a man who couldn't give her the peace she sought. The villagers around her shook their heads, murmuring words of pity and sadness. "Maybe it's best to let him be," an old man said quietly. "He's not well. No one can reach him now." But Miriam's mother shook her head, her heart aching. How could she let this go? How could she ever move on, knowing that the man who hurt her daughter was sitting here, laughing, as if nothing had happened? She looked around, seeing the pity in the villagers' eyes, and felt a deep sense of loneliness. No one could understand her pain, her anger, or her helplessness. Finally, with a heavy heart, she turned and began to walk away, her shoulders slumped. The villagers slowly moved aside, letting her pass, their eyes full of sympathy. They knew the pain she was carrying, but no one had the words to comfort her. As she walked back home, her thoughts swirled with anger, sadness, and a sense of defeat. She couldn't get the madman's laughter out of her head. It echoed in her mind, haunting her with its emptiness, its cruelty. How could he laugh after what he had done? How could he seem so untouched by the pain he had caused? When she reached home, Miriam was waiting for her, looking anxious. Her mother's face was pale, her eyes red from crying, and Miriam knew her mother had found no answers, no justice. They sat together in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, both feeling the heavy weight of the truth. As the days passed, the villagers continued to talk about Miriam and her mother. Some felt sorry for them, while others whispered rumors, casting doubt and judgment. But no one knew the true pain that filled their small home, the silent tears that fell each night as they both lay awake, unable to sleep, haunted by what had happened. Miriam's mother grew quieter each day, her spirit broken, her once strong heart now filled with sorrow. She felt as if the whole world had turned against her, leaving her and her daughter to bear this pain alone. And Miriam, too, felt the weight of shame, guilt, and confusion, her young heart burdened with emotions too heavy for her. And so they continued to live in silence, each day feeling longer than the last, each night filled with whispers of unanswered questions. As the weeks went by, Miriam's belly started to grow. Her clothes no longer fit, and the signs of her pregnancy became clear for everyone to see. The villagers began to notice, and soon the whispers turned into loud gossip. Whenever Miriam's mother went to the market, people would point and talk behind her back. They said hurtful things, calling Miriam and her mother shameful names. "Look at that girl," they would say. "How could she do such a thing? What kind of mother can't control her own daughter?" Others sneered. The mocking words reached Miriam's mother, piercing her heart each time. She tried to ignore them, but the pain was too strong. Every day, she returned home with tears in her eyes, broken by the cruel words of her neighbors. Miriam felt her mother's sadness, and it only added to her own shame and guilt. She could hear the voices from outside, the laughter, and the insults. It felt as if the whole village had turned against her. She wanted to hide, to disappear so that people would stop looking at her with such judgment and disgust. As her belly grew, Miriam stopped going outside. She didn't want to see the stares or hear the harsh words. She stayed indoors all day, sitting by the window, watching the world pass by without her. She missed school, she missed her friends, but she was too ashamed to face anyone. Her days became long and lonely, with only her mother for company. Her mother tried to be strong, to comfort her, but Miriam could see the sadness in her mother's eyes. They didn't speak much, but they both knew the pain they shared. The silence between them was filled with all the things they couldn't say. One evening, as they sat together, Miriam looked at her mother and said softly, "Mama, I'm sorry." Her voice was barely a whisper, filled with sadness. Her mother reached out and held her hand, her own eyes filling with tears. "It's not your fault, my child," she replied gently, though her voice shook with sorrow. "We will get through this somehow." But even as she said those words, Miriam's mother didn't know how they would survive this. The shame, the mocking, and the loneliness weighed heavily on them both. Each day felt harder than the last, and they felt more and more isolated from everyone around them. As the villagers continued to talk and laugh at their expense, Miriam and her mother found themselves alone, their world shrinking to the walls of their small home. They clung to each other, the only source of comfort in a world that had turned so cruel. As the months passed, Miriam's belly continued to grow, and with it, the cruelty of the villagers seemed to grow as well. Every day, their words became harsher, their laughter louder. People no longer whispered, they spoke openly, not caring if Miriam or her mother heard. The shame they heaped upon them was heavy, crushing, and it seeped into every corner of their small home. Miriam stayed indoors, too afraid and ashamed to step outside. She could no longer face the judgmental eyes of the villagers. Each time she even thought about going out, her heart would beat fast with fear. She knew that if she walked down the road, she would hear their laughter, feel their scorn. It was easier to stay inside, to hide from the world that had turned so cruel. Her mother was her only source of comfort, but even she was starting to struggle. The villagers' words had reached her ears too, and each insult felt like a blow to her heart. She had once been a proud woman, a mother who did her best to raise her children alone after her husband passed away. But now that pride was gone, replaced by sadness and shame. She barely went to the market anymore, afraid of what people would say. One afternoon, as Miriam sat by the window, she watched a group of children playing outside. They laughed and chased each other, free and happy, untouched by the troubles of the world. She remembered when she used to play like that, carefree, with friends who now avoided her like she was cursed. She felt a pang in her chest, a longing for a life she could never go back to. She felt as if she were trapped in a cage, watching the world move on without her. Her mother, noticing her sadness, walked over and sat beside her. She put a gentle hand on Miriam's shoulder, squeezing it lightly. "Don't worry, Miriam," she said softly. "This will pass. People will move on. They will forget." But Miriam didn't believe her. She knew that the villagers would not forget. Not so easily. They held on to every rumor, every piece of gossip, as if it were a precious treasure. She doubted that they would ever let her live this down. To them, she would always be the girl who brought shame to her family. Days turned into weeks, and Miriam's belly became even more noticeable. She felt the weight of it, both physically and emotionally. Each movement reminded her of the life growing inside her, a constant reminder of the pain and confusion that had taken over her life. She didn't know what to feel about the baby, whether to love it or hate it. Sometimes, in the quiet of the night, she would rest her hand on her belly and feel a strange warmth, a bond that she couldn't quite understand. But then, the faces of the villagers would flash in her mind, and she would pull her hand away, the warmth replaced by a cold emptiness. One morning, Miriam's mother decided to go to the market despite her fears. They were running low on food, and they couldn't hide forever. She wrapped a scarf around her head, hoping it would shield her from some of the stares, and set out on the familiar path, her heart heavy with dread. As she walked through the market, she could feel the eyes of the villagers on her, their whispers following her like shadows. "Look at her, the mother of that girl," one woman said, her voice dripping with scorn. "She has no shame, walking around like nothing happened," another sneered. Miriam's mother tried to ignore them, focusing on her shopping, but their words cut deep. She wanted to scream, to tell them they didn't understand, that they didn't know the whole story. But she knew it would do no good. They had already made up their minds, already cast their judgment. When she returned home, she found Miriam sitting in the same spot by the window, her face pale and tired. She looked up as her mother entered, a faint glimmer of hope in her eyes that quickly faded when she saw her mother's expression. "Mama, did they say anything?" Miriam asked quietly, though she already knew the answer. Her mother forced a weak smile, trying to hide her sadness. "Don't worry about them, Miriam," she said. "They are just words. They can't hurt us if we don't let them." But both of them knew that wasn't true. Words could hurt, and the villagers' words had already left deep wounds on both of their hearts. The shame and isolation were like a weight pressing down on them, suffocating them little by little. One night, as they sat together in the dim light of their small living room, Miriam's mother took her hand, holding it tightly. She looked into her daughter's eyes, her own eyes filled with a mixture of love, sadness, and determination. "Miriam, I want you to know that no matter what, I am here for you," she said softly. "We will get through this. I don't know how, but we will. You are my daughter, and I love you, no matter what anyone says." Miriam felt tears fill her eyes, and she squeezed her mother's hand, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you, Mama. I don't know what I would do without you." They sat together in silence, their hands entwined, finding comfort in each other's presence. In that moment, the world outside seemed to fade away, leaving only the bond between mother and daughter, a bond that no amount of shame or judgment could break. But even as they held on to each other, the future remained uncertain. The villagers' mocking laughter still echoed in their minds, a constant reminder of the harsh reality they faced. Miriam knew that life would never be the same, that the road ahead would be filled with pain and struggle. But for now, she found strength in her mother's love, a small spark of hope that kept her going, even in the darkest of times. As the days continued, Miriam rarely left the house, and her mother did her best to protect her from the world outside. They lived in a fragile bubble, shielded from the cruelty of the villagers, but aware that the bubble could burst at any moment. Each day, they waited, hoping for a miracle, for something to change. But the shadows of doubt and fear loomed over them, and they knew that the hardest days were yet to come. This story ends here for now, but please subscribe to be notified when subsequent episodes drop. Thank you for watching.